Hey everyone, and welcome to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, that is Connor, and we are going to talk about Lovecraft Country, Season 1, Episode 1. It is called Sundown, and it is an Episode 1, so we will start spoiler-free. Give our thoughts and feelings on it before we get into the spoilers. We'll warn you before we do so about halfway through. This is the new HBO series, executive produced by Jordan Peele and J.J. Abrams, sort of set in the South in the Jim Crow era, 1950s of America, and kind of mixes the real racial history of the country with, well, as the title would imply, actual Lovecraft monsters and all that kind of stuff. And we'll get into kind of how the show tackles that as throughout. I've been looking forward to this one right from the first time this was ever like kind of mentioned. That this premise was intriguing to me.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it. It must have been 2 or 3 years ago now that we heard about it, and it's kind of been on our radar ever since.
Yeah, it was hard not to. Obviously, some of the creative talent behind it. And then just the premise, and then as we got closer, even Johnny Smollett Bell, who's the female lead of the series, has become more of a known entity since.
Yeah, thanks to her role as Black Canary in the Birds of Prey movie just a few months ago.
Yeah, Birds of Prey and a couple of other things recently.
Yeah, that's the most high profile one though, for sure.
But yeah, so this is. Yeah, it's a horror show, but it's a horror show where I kind of went into it not really sure how much it would focus on that, because there was like hints of things in the trailers, but I was kind of curious if, like, is it going to be more of a drama first with little snippets of horror? How much is it going to dive into that kind of thing? I was really curious about how its focus would be divvied up amongst those things. So we'll get into it. I suppose I'll just ask the question then. How did you feel about episode 1 of Lovecraft Country?
I thought it was really quite very good.
You intentionally put a weird pause in there to make me think you were going to say something negative, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Yes. I also thought it was very good too. I think it did a really smart thing where it gave us this ridiculously over-the-top opening dream sequence just to let us know that, okay, we're going to go slowly after this for a bit, but here's just how insane visually we might get once if you stick around. Here's some wacky stuff.
It was the promise of things to come, right?
Well, this is the thing. After that opening, I thought, okay, they've given us a big opening. Maybe it'll be like 5 episodes before we get to a thing. But this is the thing. By the end of the first episode, which is a little bit longer, it's about 70 minutes, this first one, the last like 10-15 minutes, it goes balls deep into the horror. It's not shying away from the fact that this is also a monster show with mythology and history and all these things. You were saying,
you weren't sure how much it was going to be, a drama or a horror, and for like 50 minutes or so, I'm like, okay, we're doing the drama. We had the intro, but we're mainly drama for at least for now. And then by the end of the episode, it's like, okay, no, I need to reconsider.
Although with the caveat that I'd add on to that, I say drama. I think one of the things this episode does very well is that it takes everyday Black American like situations from the time period and turns almost every one of them into a horror movie. Because I felt unbelievably tense during several sequences of this episode, which had nothing to do with, monsters, quote unquote. I mean, real life monsters, sure, but not,
Absolutely. I think I was just separating human drama and the supernatural horror. Of course, there is very, real horror, amongst it, pretty much the whole way through. The
reason why I point it out, though, is because I think there's a couple of key sequences where it does treat it like a horror movie, where the way it builds...
There absolutely is, yeah.
It builds the moment with the music and the tension and the sort of watching the build-up to it.
Even there's an action sequence about halfway through, maybe, the episode, that feels like it could have been in a horror movie. Like, I could see that sort of sequence in like a Purge movie, for example. Just in terms of that style of horror.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Purge is borderline, but yeah.
Sure, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, I was very impressed with all the tension in the episode. I think the tone that it's shooting for and taking all the real history in, and it's something that when we talked about this in the news and when it first came up that this was happening, and we talked about how Lovecraft, the writer, has a bit of a sordid past. He was a bit of a bigot and
that's notorious racist is kind of what you're looking for there.
Yeah, I was putting that a bit later than I should have done, and I always thought the show was going to play with that a little bit and kind of deal with the double meaning of saying Lovecraft Country. Both in the real and the fantastical sense. But the show actually does kind of take that and addresses it very quickly. It becomes kind of a character beat for our main character, Atticus, who they call Tick, where he says that when his father caught him reading Lovecraft as a child, his father made him memorize a particularly racist passage or a poem from Lovecraft, which I thought was really neat to sort of set that up immediately. And there's even a conversation before that when he's talking. He's on his way back to Chicago. He's on the premise of the first episode is that Atticus is on his way home because his father's went missing. His father, who we see him in a photograph, I think, here, but we've not seen him yet. But that's Michael Kenneth Williams, who most people know from The Wire, but he's been popping up in tons of stuff over the years. And he's going back home to try and help look for him, find him. But when he's on his way, he's talking with this old woman, and right away it sets up the themes of the episode where the bus breaks down that they're on traveling, and the sort of the guy with a truck who comes out to like, okay, I'll transport the passengers with my truck. Immediately there's this tension because it doesn't seem like he's going to want Atticus and this other one black woman who's there, this old woman, to ride with them. So they end up walking, and they're talking about stuff, and there's this debate that comes up because he's reading John Carter, which I've never read, and I didn't know this tidbit that comes up in this conversation, where he's an ex-Confederate soldier, and she says, wait, you can't really put an X in front of that, like, you're rooting for this character. He's like, well, you hope he's going to get better.
He mentions, I think the key part is, when it comes to stories, you just kind of have to sometimes roll with it, even, flaws and all. You can't, forget the flaws are there, and and you can't ignore them, but sometimes, especially in older stories, you have to still take what is good out of the story for yourself. Is kind of what he's saying here.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, I think there's obviously a lot of meaning you can derive from that sentiment. I think there's two in particular ones that I want to just sort of point out here. One is the idea that this show is taking a lot of Lovecraft mythology, even though Lovecraft himself was a pretty awful person, and a lot of his stuff maybe came from his own bigotry, but that so many people have taken what he created and done things with it. There's a reason why we still keep going back to those images, because there's some artistic value in them.
There's a reason why the entire subgenre is called Lovecraftian.
Yeah. And then on top of that, you have the wonderful meta thing here, where this is a show with black main characters, black heroes, who is now here for people growing up. Not that I'm saying kids should be watching this show necessarily, but for people who are maybe in their teens or getting older, there is it just so happens that I just watched Horror Noir on Shudder the other week. It's a documentary about black representation in horror movies throughout the decades, and it was particularly notable sort of watching and like, okay, there's an era where they're not in movies at all, there's an era where they're only comic relief, there's an era where they're this, they're that, and how long it took to get to a point where no, there's actually movies being made with black lead characters with those experiences for an audience.
I mean, it's still pretty recent. It's why things like Us still hit the nerve they did.
Look at you trying to not say Get Out because it's the too obvious the example.
I know. I was really trying. I was like, yeah.
Look at you trying so hard.
I really did try, and you just ruined it.
Well, because you went to the same director's next movie. Yes, yes. Very sly. No one's going to notice.
I know.
No one's going to notice.
And do you know what it was? It's in my head because obviously he's attached to this show.
Yes, he's producer. Yeah, so yeah, but I think there is kind of a wonderful statement there that in your opening scenes of this, you're saying, hey, for a long time, characters and people like this have had to sort of just deal with the stories that they have access to because this is what exists.
Because
and
it was better than nothing, essentially.
Yeah, but obviously have to have all these caveats and kind of sort of always have this filter of how they look at stories like this. And here's a story, here's a TV show, a big budget prestige HBO series, which, if it does well, maybe years and years, but at the very least you're getting 10 high profile episodes of high quality television about characters in this situation.
Just based off of the amount of early reaction that I saw on social media, which again isn't a real indicator, but it seemed positive. It seemed like there was a lot of people checking it out. I would be, as of right now, surprised if we didn't get more of this, unless the creators only want to do one season for whatever reason.
As would I. I feel like just having watched the episode now and seeing the level of quality, seeing kind of what it could be building to over time, it feels like something that will be very easy to talk about every week, and I can see it being something of a, I hate the phrase water cooler show, but it kind of feels like it may have that going for it.
Yeah.
Which is good. It's good for it. And it's one of these things where every so often we get an example of a show like this made for a specific audience, and we've had a couple of aims primarily at the black audience over the last few years. Dear White People, things like that, and one of the weird things is that when a show or when a storytelling is good, like part of storytelling is empathizing with characters. So empathy, like, so I guess what I'm saying here is that there's like, yeah, I do believe this is made primarily for a black audience, and they should have media made for them because hell knows they didn't for a long ass time. But when you bring empathy into it, you can watch stories about anyone. So the white audience should still latch onto this. There's no reason why they shouldn't, and it should have a big following of all kinds.
And I hope it will. And it kind of boils down to, you know, that conversation about, you know, when he's talking about John Carter is ultimately, okay, there can be things that maybe you don't connect with because obviously he's not connecting with the ex-Confederate part there. But if there's enough in the story to keep you entertained and, you know, and keep you attached, then there's no reason why you shouldn't care. And that, you know, in this scenario is, you know, the non-black audience should be like, no, that's it's irrelevant that you're not connecting to a certain part of the experience. There's so much quality entertainment here.
That's a dodgy comparison for me because they're very different things.
They are, yeah.
They're very different things. Like I like not. Yes, because one is actively something you should hate in something. Not connecting with something in this because you don't have that experience is not the same as like, oh, I have to ignore this because it's actively a detriment to the character or to the writing or whatever.
I agree. I just mean the core premise of attaching to the part of stories that you know that work with you, and you know, and having that enough there for entertainment. And I can't see why there isn't enough in this for entertainment for pretty much anyone.
No, and part of the charm or the beauty of storytelling is empathizing with people with different experiences. And if, you know, people, white or otherwise, watch this and see some of these horror scenarios that aren't the monsters, that are the more real life stuff that, you know, you'd like to think is less of an issue now, and maybe it's less in your face with signs, but ultimately isn't, then, you know, maybe some more empathy's built and gained, and someone's perspective has changed because of that. So, I mean, that's kind of your noble, like, possible outcome. But at the very least, what this is a show about characters who don't typically get this type of story, set in an age where they get to explore all these ideas. And I think we have, you know, three leads. We have Letitia, who's Bill's character. Clearly the love interest. They're old friends from school, though they know each other. Her and Tick, and then you have George, his uncle, as obviously his father's brother, but that's specifically notable because it's, you know, he's been missing. So
yeah, that's why there's the connection there.
Yeah. So we have these three characters who essentially go on this road trip because they're looking for where he might have gone, and there's a tease early on that there might be some sort of like family history, like some sort of birthright based on his mother's side of the family that ties into all this supernatural stuff.
Yeah, and we know very little about his mother's at this point, right?
Yeah, so far,
they didn't really give us much.
No. I mean, the ending, which obviously not going to talk about yet because we're still on spoiler free, but the ending is kind of a, like, out of nowhere. What's going on? What's this?
Yep. Yeah, so it definitely is.
That's definitely something we can dive into next time. But no, I thought this first episode was really good. I thought there was several key sequences, even before we got to horror stuff. It seems like it's having a lot of fun with the horror stuff. It's not shying away from gore or anything like that. It's going full.
There's a point in the episode where they describe a particular Lovecraft monster.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, again, I'm not going to spoil which one it is. And then when you see it kind of later, I'm like, oh, okay, that looks good. This is fun.
So you got all that. Yeah, I don't really have much. I mean, if I have a critique about the episode, is that maybe in the first like third, when he's just in Chicago kind of looking around and we're getting interested in all the characters, maybe the party scene goes on just a little bit too long with the songs. Like, I didn't necessarily need the whole song. That was like the only. No, that was the only thing. I thought the introduction to all the other characters, or not even the others, like even the introduction to the characters in that scene, I thought was good. It just the song itself went on too long, but all the other scenes that introduced characters, I thought was really good. You get a sense that his, because his niece, I assume, is like also creative with monsters and science fiction stories, like he is, and she comics.
Writes a comic for a dad every time he goes on a road trip, because that's his job. He writes a guidebook for, you know, for where it's safe to go, essentially for black people while they're traveling.
Yeah. These towns are unsafe, these towns are particularly bad, that kind of thing.
Which seems like a pretty dangerous job to have to test that firsthand.
Yeah, and his wife wants to actually sort of go instead at one point, and he's very nervous about that. He doesn't really want that to happen. And that sort of brings in some other issues that we can sort of tackle as a series. And there is kind of the interesting naming of her character and presumably their daughters, Hippolyta and Diana, which is obviously for any Wonder Woman fans out there, that is Wonder Woman and her mother in terms of the names. So yeah, super interesting. Notably though, they were pronouncing Hippolyta, I think they were saying. I've always said Hippolyta. That's how I've always heard it.
Yeah, it's how I've heard it as well.
So I'll try and say it the way they're saying it, but I feel like it's so ingrained in my brain, to be honest. At this point, I'm going to struggle.
If I hear it enough, I'll get used to it.
Yeah.
But it's not actually said that often.
I think the problem is that it's not just like it's something from the past. It's something that I'm currently reading Wonder Woman comics, and no doubt it's going to keep coming up. I'm going to keep seeing it and hearing it.
It was an interesting moment when I noticed the name connection. So we heard hers pretty early on, and she just says, "Oh, Dee's awake," and I'm like, "Okay, fine."
Yeah.
And it's not until they just casually drop a name a couple of minutes later as Diana. I'm like, "Oh, okay, I see where you're going with that." Yeah,
no. And I do, it's kind of fun seeing these characters who are like super into this stuff, particularly, Tick and his niece, and they all seem to be really into because George has obviously he has these jobs to write these guidebooks, but he does have like a big library kind of shop, and there's a lot of like fiction, there's a lot of like horror and science fiction and stuff like that. It seems to be something that they're all pretty into.
Yeah, well, we know Letty's into it as well because she mentioned she was the only female member of the sci-fi book club.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder like how much that knowledge is going to come into it. Is there?
It's interesting. And something while we're talking about this is I'm remembering all these names really well, which is unusual. Let's be honest for us after our first episode. Which I think goes to show just how strongly defined all the characters are already, that I can just think of them just like that. I'm not having to label them with certain characteristics. Like, usually it's, the uncle or, the friend or whatever in my head at first, whereas these are all fully formed already.
Yeah, and it helps that just a few of them had sort of moments where their name was I mean, Letty had a couple, actually, because she had, when she first was into Tick again, and he calls her Letty, and that's when the whole thing, all my friends call me Letty, but are we still friends? Well, you were the only female member of the sci-fi club. So that was the kind of moment that made it really kind of like easy to remember her name. And then later on we had the whole thing where I won't go into the details for spoiler's sake, but there's a whole moment where she kind of yells out, Letty effing Lewis, and it becomes kind of a sort of heat of the moment sort of thing to yell. So she has a couple of things where her name feels really kind of memorable. So,
which, again, it's not a huge deal because even lots of shows that we've ended up loving, we have struggled with names for 3-4 episodes. So I don't really hold it against any show. But it stuck out to me as we're talking about this, just how easily they're all coming to me right now. I'm not even got a list up next to me like I sometimes do.
Yeah. I mean, I have just in case, because
one of us should, just for safety's sake.
Yeah, inevitably my brain will have a fart moment, as it often does.
Yeah.
But no, I really dug this first episode. I think all the elements work. So I think we will give the spoiler warning here, so we can talk about what actually happens in the plot. So full spoilers for episode 1 of Lovecraft Country. So we mentioned obviously the start, but we do have to talk a little bit about the dream sequence at the start when he wakes up, because he's in. I thought it looked more like World War I to begin with, like the trenches, and it's intentionally black and white to begin with, and then it's like when an asteroid hits, like there's like sort of color comes into it from the asteroid, and then when he actually climbs out the trenches, we see like classic 1950s style UFOs and almost like War of the World. What do you call them? The try something. Try.
Oh, that's kind of annoying.
Yeah. Anyway, and then eventually it becomes this thing where like Cthulhu shows up, but then Tick's favorite baseball player cuts Cthulhu in half with his baseball bat, and then of course Cthulhu reforms and he turns around, he's like, "Well, sorry, I got you, kid," and he's like, got the baseball, and I'm like, this is insane and silly and wonderful. This is just everything.
It's kind of bizarre, right?
Yeah. It's very on HBO actually. I don't think I've ever felt this flair of silly fun in a HBO show.
I agree. HBO shows tend to take themselves a little bit more seriously.
And I think this does take itself fairly seriously once it gets going. It's just that it's clearly not afraid from... I think certainly one of the themes of this is the idea of storytelling and their love of imagination and fiction, and so I think clearly being able to dip into that and in fact maybe even use it as a tool, as they do later on when they kind of figure out a weakness of the monster to maybe help.
It's going to be interesting to see how it does play with this, because it's clearly a strong element that it's establishing. It's the first thing it does, and it only just solidifies that over the episode. That I can't wait to see how it utilizes this idea. Yeah.
So basically, the road trip's kind of decided where George is going to come along because he's like, well, I've not been through these areas anyway, so I might as well do this as my next guide, chapter or whatever, whatever the terminology is, and we have Letty gets sort of tagged on because she's going to see her brother, and that's kind of on the way, so she's kind of tagging along for a bit. Of course, being the third main character, we assume that she's going
to stick around for reasons.
Yes, it actually, I kind of liked how simple it was. It was just like her and her brother just kind of have a fight, and it's like she's just not staying here. Like this is
like you can't stay here with him.
Yeah. So nice and simple, but there's a lot of turmoil along the way. There's a wonderful montage. I don't know the speech that's playing over it. There's like a recording of a famous speech playing. As we see just simple things. There's like an ice cream parlor that's got the separate like serving windows for white people and black people. And it's just that you see the black people waiting whereas I think the staff's just chatting with the person at the other window. They're not even serving anyone. And you get this kind of sense, and it builds up this atmosphere. And there's all these little moments, even when he's in Chicago, like Tick's walking past the street, and there's like a white, either policeman or maybe a fireman, who's closing up the fire hydrant that all the kids are playing in. And he's kind of just looking over just to make sure that there's nothing that it needs to kind of step in and help the kids with. There's little moments where you kind of get this sense of they always have to be aware. They always have to be kind of on the lookout.
On edge.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the horror of it work so well, is that the whole episode you feel just on edge and you're just waiting for something to boil over, whether that's the human horror or the supernatural.
Yeah. Well, is that big sign when they decide to take this detour into this small town so they can get some food a bit earlier, and there's that thing where they're driving past the fire station, and the dog starts barking at the car, and you immediately get the sense that this dog has been trained to bark at black people, and that immediately is like a bit of a red flag. It's a warning sign. It's
something as well. In so much media, especially in horror and sci-fi, dogs bark at the monsters, right? That's like a classic trope in those stories. So to use it here like this is kind of gut-wrenching. Yeah, and just that idea that this dog has been trained to see a black person as a monster, and it tells you a lot about the owner. It tells you a lot about the town they're in. And they go to this small diner. They want served. The guy who works there is just speechless. He can't even say anything. They sit down in a booth, and it's very tense, and you feel uneasy right away. And it kind of bubbles over when Letty goes to the bath, and even her going off to the bathroom herself, I got worried. Like, is there going to be someone else there? Is there going to be some sort of confrontation? I was on edge the entire time. Yeah, I was the same, because when she says she's just going, I was almost concerned for her when none of the guys were like, do you want us to come, wait outside or anything?
Yeah.
They just let her go on her own. I was like, is this safe? It doesn't feel safe right now.
Yeah, I was very much on edge, and then they run out, and basically we hear a siren, like the kid called the local station.
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely sure who he called though as well, because I don't know if it was passed along or if it was just the station.
I mean, it's a small town. I don't think it really matters that much.
It was because. Go on.
That's just the idea that the small town. So even if he just called his uncle Fred, and then Fred called the guy that he knows that works at the fire station, and they come along with their shotguns. I mean, that's basically. It was
a really well done sequence because at the start, they go there, they're expecting the name to be Liddy's or something like that. Is the name of the place, and then they get there and it's not. They're like, it's definitely the right building, but it's not the name we were expecting.
It's changed, yeah. Maybe new ownership, whatever. No big deal, happens all the time.
And then when she overhears the phone call, she hears him say, "No, I didn't serve them. I know what you did to Liddy after that." And you're like, "Oh God." And this is kind of at the same time as Tick's looking around, kind of going, something's not right in this room, and putting the pieces together himself.
Yeah, Basically seeing that the all the decor's been overdone because it was burned before, implying that someone was either it was torched or even someone may have been burned in here. It compares it to the story of how the White House ended up being painted white, and it's all this stuff, and this ends up in a bit of a chase sequence where they're in the car and they're driving, and there's a mysterious. This is kind of the first kind of like what's going on here. There's a mysterious woman who sort of pulls out her car in front of the people who are chasing them, and flips it.
It's a really interesting sequence because at first, obviously, they're just driving away, and it's really great, well shot action chase sequence as it is. And then they see this other car coming down the other side, and they're like, "Great, if we can get ahead of that car, it puts a car safe between us." And you're like, "Okay, cool. They're just using the surroundings. It's fine." And then the other car actively swerves to make the ones chasing them have to brake, and one of them goes flying off the top.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, that was obviously an intentional move. And you're like, okay, so who is this already before she steps out?
Yeah, then she gets out and she sort of looks at Tick from a distance and just like a sort of weird moment of something. And I assume it ties into the ending of the episode and the person we meet there, who's different, but, probably is connected to this person.
Very similar style of look.
Yeah. I don't even know what to call that look, but...
No, it's very specific, isn't it?
Yes. So... And then they get to the brother's place, Letty's brother's place, and there was a phone call actually with George talking to Diana on the phone, and then to his wife. And when he's talking to the wife, he says, "Hey, I was thinking next time, how about you come with me and we can do the guidebook together?" And it's this very sweet moment because I thought their introduction was very sweet as well in bed earlier on in the episode. Thought it felt very natural. Everything that came up felt very kind of genuine. I got a little bit worried though that this scene, because he'd sort of said, "Hey, what about next time you come with me?" and she felt he'd really take to that. I got really concerned and thought, is he going to be dead before the end of this episode? Because it felt like they're making me care about him just enough.
I felt the exact same when it had that moment. My heart sank. I was like, he's not getting home. They're not ever getting on that trip together.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt too. And he's still alive at the end of the episode. Although they definitely teased me because there were several moments later on where George seemed like he was maybe left behind to be killed or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like it felt like there was multiple moments. But so getting to the supernatural mythology mystery stuff though is that they're looking for not Arkham. He thinks it's Arkham at first because his father's handwriting's not that good. I'll be honest, cursive handwriting's terrible. I can barely read it at the best of times. But because it does the close up right after they talk about how the word like is actually Ardham and not Arkham. It does the close up to the magnifying glass, and I'm like, I can't even tell which word I'm supposed to be looking at.
People say this, and I can literally only write in cursive. I can't write any other way. I can't write like if you give me a pen, that is the only way I can write anything. I'm not saying it'll necessarily be legible because my handwriting's terrible, but it's the only way I can write.
I can write it. I can barely read it though. I can barely read my own cursive handwriting. I legitimately in school got into trouble because I couldn't repeat what I'd written at some point. Because they forced me to learn cursive, and it serves no purpose in the world. No one needs cursive writing for anything in the planet. It is pointless.
It's quicker.
It's pointless. It's pointless.
I mean, it is now that we write everything on computers, but
yeah, get a goddamn laptop. You don't need write cursive.
Yeah, but that availability wasn't there as we were in school. Now it's kind of irrelevant.
It's pointless. It's stupid. I hate it.
But at the time, it is the quickest way to write. And if you're writing at speed and taking notes, and it's the only way you've got any chance of keeping up.
Any comic book that puts cursive intentional style text to try and mimic like a diary in its text box, screw you too. I'm not having it, right? Okay. I hate cursive, alright? It's terrible. It's gobbledygook. My eyes can't decipher it. It's just a squiggly line. So, anyway, what was I getting to? Oh, yes, so fun part here though, so looking for this Ardham, right? Not Arkham, Ardham. And it's like, okay, it's not on the map, but there's kind of everything says it should be in this kind of area. And something that Tick brings up that I think is a really cool idea is like, well, if we get like the official sort of like, what the lines are for all the surrounding towns or counties, theoretically it should leave like a block that should be Ardham. It just isn't on the map. It's like just like a blank section.
Yeah, and they mentioned like the last official record they can find of it is like 200 years ago.
Yeah, so very intriguing. So they go looking kind of in this area, looking for like a road that goes, and they're kind of fighting a little bit in the car because like they can't find it. And Tech's like, well, what if it's overgrown? If it's not used, maybe shrubbery and stuff and foliage is all kind of covered it. Maybe it's just not easy to see anymore. And this is where we get to probably my favorite sequence of the episode in terms of tension.
It's up there.
Is so as Tick and Letty are talking outside the car and they're sort of joking about, because one of the things that comes up as well is that Diana has this like sort of her own version of the map where she's like put like different monsters in different places, and Tick kind of has looked at it a bit and he kind of brings it up and says, hey, this is this Joe, it's on her map here, it's it's werewolves or something. He sort of says it a couple of times for different places, and as they're sort of joking about it, saying, well, we can outrun that. Yeah, but Uncle George can't. Which is actually kind of foreshadowing, given what happens later. There's not the other time the episode kind of does something like that I liked, where when he goes back to his father's place, when it's it's obviously empty, at one point he looks like a sort of dent in the wall, and I liked how that came up later when he's talking to George about the last time he spoke to his father, how they actually get into a bit of a shoving match.
Yeah.
So no, I like that. But we just see this police car pull up behind them, and immediately there's this feeling.
That tension of being on edge, it starts bubbling over already.
Yeah. And this is one of these things. I remember, to bring up Get Out, I remember feeling really tense towards the end of that movie. I won't get into the details just in case you've not seen it, but there's a moment where there's like a cop car pulling up. And even then in 2017, I was already like kind of terrified immediately that something really bad was about to happen, because, the police brutality was already...
It's not new.
It's not new, obviously. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But at that point, it was already where it was well known to me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. In 2020, after the summer we've just been having, it's more at the forefront than it's ever been. So watching this and seeing this cop car pull up behind them immediately, and then in your head you're also thinking it's also the 50s. Like, if anything, that just multiplies it by...
Yeah, it's not in a great spot, is it?
No. And it's very tense immediately that George is told to get out the car, and he says, do you know what a sundown town is? And they say, yes. Well, this is Sundown County. If you don't get out of this county, if I caught you here after dark, he threatens to hang them.
Yeah, you go, it would be my duty to hang you, I think he says.
Yeah. And he said, and they're like, okay, well, we'll leave right now. We'll get out of the county. He's like, well, if you go that direction, sundown's in 9 minutes or whatever it is. Like, there's no way you're going to make it. So, well, we'll go that direction. We'll go north instead. He's like, yeah, that might work. And Tick, sort of, who's been shown throughout the episode to be quite smart. He's always very quick-witted. He always seems to sort of predict the problems before they happen. Even in the diner, he's the one who kind of like notices that something's wrong and kind of
he's putting the pieces together, yeah. And
he turns and says, is it legal to make a U-turn in this road? Which, I'll be honest, is something that I would never have thought of in a million years. No, admittedly, I don't drive, but this is a country road. I would not think for a second that you couldn't take a U-turn here. There's like there's no cars. And
that's pretty much why it's a generally ignored rule, because as long as there's no driver discretion, no one's going to see you. Who cares?
Yeah, right? Yeah, pretty much. And the cop's like, oh, you're very smart. Almost like he wanted them to try it without asking. Just
because he knows that if they start speeding, well, I can pull them over for that.
Yeah, and he makes them say something awful. He makes them sort of ask politely using racial language, and it's really, just
demeaning.
Demeaning, yeah. I was gonna say dehumanizing, but same difference. But he bites his tongue. He says it, and on they go. But this was a really well shot sequence, because one of the difficult things about filming stuff is, like, typically you like it to either be nice and bright or completely dark. Doing stuff at the time where it's changing, either sundown or sunup,
it's awkward.
It's awkward and difficult. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's a lot of color correction to make a lot of things fit here that otherwise probably didn't magically all.
But they do
together.
A good job of it, which matters.
Yeah, it felt very natural having this sort of race to get to the county line,
and it's so unique in comparison to the earlier chase, which is a high octane car chase where they're speeding as fast as they can, and this here he sees 25 miles an hour is the speed limit, so he has to slow down and be like, right, can't go any quicker. And got to stay at this. So it's really steady and almost it's agonizingly slow.
Yeah, and the entire time the cop's behind them just in case they speed. Even starts ramming into them at various points. But the other thing it does really smart as well is that it gives us a simple visual because it says we I think it's the, I don't know if it's the cop or if they just figure it out from the map, but they say that, oh, well, there's train tracks, and once we cross the train tracks, that's us out of the county. And,
I think they figure it out from the map, yeah.
Yeah, so it gives us this visual, simple idea of a finish line, because otherwise it may not be that obvious, because
usually there's like a signpost, like you are now leaving or entering wherever, but this here, it's like I say, it's an actual line. It's really obvious from afar.
Very visual, very distinct. But of course, it's all a ruse, and we have this lineup of cops blocking the road after the train tracks. But I did think, I thought this was wonderfully shot. The visual of the sun going down and them kind of like racing against it, but having to go slow, made it far more tense than it otherwise I think it would have been. And it's worth mentioning as well that this cop, this captain, I think he is, or the sheriff, whatever the sheriff, is that he has a reputation, and this is something that Letty's brother, like, sort of doing a bit of digging around because they knew they were going there. He looked into the area, and like, this guy's got a reputation. This guy is rough, and there's a lot of stories as well of people getting mauled in the woods by something. So it does tease as well.
They assume obviously wolves or bears or something. They're like, so there's some sort of animals in the surrounding area, and also the sheriff is notable for how bad he is. Even amongst this terrible time period, he stands out.
Yeah, so we have this horrible scene where they're taking it into the woods, all three, and they're put in the ground. We have 4 or 5 ultra racist cops, and you're genuinely worried, like, are they just going to kill them? Is this all this is? Is this just all building up to that? And they're trying to talk their way out of it, but everything they say is something offensive to them, right? Like, it doesn't matter. It's like at one point, Tick is like, "Hey, you think we're these robbers from this other thing?" Which is never mentioned before this scene. All of a sudden, the cops are just talking about, "Oh, there's been a robbery somewhere last week," and
convenient. These will do as, I guess, suspects.
I mean, I guess they'll quote unquote fit the description, to use a term that's thrown around a lot. And Tick says, "Hey, even search the car," and the sheriff is offended. Did he just give me permission to search his car? With a few more racial slurs put in there, which I'm obviously not going to repeat. And it's like, oh, where's this going? Like, and almost to the point where, okay, my meta brain, my I'm watching a TV show brain says, well, clearly the monsters are going to be what actually stops whatever's about to happen here. This is where we're going to, because they've made us hate these characters so much. We're going to be over the moon. Watch them be brutally torn apart, and they did not disappoint with the level of gore and brutal tearing apart ofness.
They did not. And out rolls. I don't know if that's the correct thing. The eye blob monster. That name I'm forgetting. That it was the one that Tick was talking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, it bites off the sheriff's arm initially because we have him around later, armless.
Which is again this wonderful horrific sequence where even these cops are incredibly racist and just looking at any excuse to kill these 3 people. Yet these real horrific monsters show up, and these cops are so scared they're not even concerned about the black people anymore. They're like, "I'll worry about that later. We just need to survive right now."
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the real sort of monsters are less evil. I mean, to quote Ellen Ripley from Aliens, you don't see them effing over each other for a percentage.
Yeah. I mean, you don't hate, assuming the monsters are non-sentient, right? You don't hate an alligator for taking a bite out of someone. it's acting on instinct, right? Yeah. You can be scared of alligators, you can respect them and fear them, but you don't hate them.
Yeah.
But and that's the difference, right?
We see a few of them. One of the little things, because George gets left behind when everyone's running around here in fear, and I love the visual of George like prying the flashlight out of the arm, because the sheriff's arm was holding a flashlight, so he like grabs the. There's a little bit of a struggle as you just try to pry it out.
It doesn't quite come out neatly. It's still got some residual grip.
Yeah, I love it. And they end up in this old sort of like cabin that's in the middle of the woods, because it's a horror story. Of course, it's a cabin. It's
classic, right?
Yeah. And there's 2 cops. There's a sheriff with missing one arm, and then one other cop. And they're, of course, you're just not listening to anything that Tick or Letty are saying. George eventually gets there, and they figure out, and this is really neat. We sort of one of them quotes Dracula, and And then someone says, well, yeah, like, George is like, well, they never came after me when I was holding the flashlight. What if that's the trick here? What if it's kind of like a vampire? Not exactly, because it's not specifically daylight, but just the light. To compare to something this is actually more accurate to, I'd say Pitch Black, if anyone's seen that. It's kind of the rules in that movie. But maybe what if they just, light's their weakness, and therefore if we just survive till sundown, or sun up rather, we'll be fine. We just have to get light. It's like, okay, we've got some extra lit flares and lights in the car, so...
I'm getting some Alan Wake vibes.
Sure. Oh yeah, I could see that. And they make Let It Go, because they think Tick might try something, so...
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly he's going to try, because it seems weird to me their logic here, where he might try and escape or something. I think that's what they're afraid of.
Yeah, it's leaving Letty and George to die.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly, and that's the bit that I feel like I'm missing in their logic. Like, at least with their hatred, I understand. I can functionally get my head around just, they're racist pieces of shit. This bit here, I'm like, I don't understand your brain right now.
Well, I guess maybe that's like, they also expect him to be cowardly who would sacrifice the people he's with.
Possibly.
So it's just again, another level to the racism. Why would they not
expect that of her?
Because she's a weak woman and is scared and needs the men to protect her.
Maybe that is it.
I think that's their logic. I mean, the sexism I don't think is brought up as much here, but I've got a funny feeling they're probably also sexist pieces of shit. I'm just going to make an assumption.
I'm willing to go on a limb and agree. Yeah.
That would be my guess. And they probably just assume George can't make it because he's older. Which...
Well, I mean, he struggled just to get to the cabin in comparison, so I think it's a reasonable assumption.
But no, so much like vampires, though, the one comparison that does make sense here is that the sheriff starts to mutate into a monster himself, and the other cop would rather like defy the good advice from the black person who's saying, hey, he's turning, you're going to have to shoot him, and instead doesn't, and gets his own face bit off as a result. One of my favorite visuals is when the monster actually like bites off like the top. I think it's actually before when they run to the cabin, one of the other cops. It bites off like the entire top half of one of their bodies.
It's like, and you've got all this from like the shoulder kind of just ripped open, all this exposed flesh.
Yeah. And at one point there's like sort of like the tongues coming through the middle of the stomach or something like that. It's really brutal.
It looks so good.
Really fun stuff. And even the run to the car for Letty's pretty good. But she drives a car back into the cabin because she does get there. She does have a bit of a close call though with the monster jumping on the front of the car, but she used the lights obviously and does her best. And they end up having to sort of stand off with a bunch of flares and make it till morning. So yeah, there's a good 15-20 minute sequence here, or maybe even longer than that if you include the Sundown kind of car chase, if you want to call it that. That's just fantastic from start to end. There's like nothing...
I think while I agree, from that Sundown point is phenomenal. I think it still separates, because that chase feels okay. That's the human horror, right?
Yeah.
And it's not until after they get across and the sun goes down that it switches gears. So it feels like two very distinct points of the episode,
sure.
even though they run right into each other.
I just mean from a quality point of view. That was where it just started firing all cylinders and didn't let up. And then the ending, of course, is they're walking all covered in blood. The car's been wrecked from the getting out of the house. And they get to this mansion in Ardham, presumably, and they go up, about to knock on the door, and the door just opens before they even have a chance. And this really posh, very blonde, kind of Aryan, Swedish-looking dude.
Yeah, I'm getting, I don't know, some kind of weird vampire vibes from him.
He looks like he maybe belonged to the Edward Cullen family. That's not.
That's what it is.
That's not split hairs here.
Yeah, maybe that's what's doing it for me.
The poshest...
It's something about the eyes as well. Yeah. It's got that look to it.
I don't know if he actually had blue eyes, but I just, in my memory, he has really blue eyes and he's really blonde and slick back hair.
I don't know if they were blue. I remember them being very bright.
Yeah. He's like, oh, we've been waiting for you. Welcome home, being the very key phrase. So this obviously ties into the mother side of the family, the heritage that was brought up. So how it all ties in, I have no idea. It's definitely, we talk about episode 1's often having that hook where, okay, here's another element that... It was technically teased in that they brought up the mother earlier on, but we didn't really get a feel for what it actually meant or what it was about. I still think this counts completely as a sort of, here's a completely new idea, because up until now it's been very focused on this one key kind of avenue.
It has, yeah.
Well, two avenues technically, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, really great stuff. Really great ending. And then just something that we haven't really mentioned is Tick's recent past. He went off to serve in the army.
Oh yeah, I can't believe we've not even talked about this shit. Yeah,
I'm assuming he was stationed in Korea.
The Korean War, I assume.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's where he was. But he obviously met someone over there, because he makes a phone call at one point, and I was like, this is a really long number. Like, this feels weirdly long when he's reading it out. And then, the operator goes, oh, that's in Korea. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, oh, well, that explains why it felt weirdly long.
Yeah, because there was a year code in front of the whatever the number was, yeah.
Yeah. But I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then whoever it is, gets a bit weird on the other end, right?
Yeah, because she says, like, oh, it's you. You went home, didn't you? Almost as if she's disappointed, as if like that was like something she didn't want him to do.
Yeah,
but not in the way that's why he left her necessarily. Because like, why would? Because she wouldn't be. It doesn't sound like she's surprised that he's like gone. Just surprised or disappointed that he went home.
Almost felt like when he hung up the phone after, it almost felt like he was scared of them.
Yeah, he couldn't talk. Yeah, he was beside himself with emotion, and whether that's just because he was in love with this person and it's too hard to talk to them, or if there's something else to it that's a bit more plot.
But I'm interested to see where this goes as well, because again, it's actually a relatively minor part of the episode, which is why we're 45 odd minutes in before we even got to it. But it feels like it will be important.
Well, it's minor because I think obviously it's maybe overshadowed by all the other stuff that we've talked about, but I do think it's another example of this show really setting up good, strong characters for the three leads. I mean, Letty gets maybe the least, but even she gets a lot in both the conversation she has with her sister early on, because the sister is the one who's singing at the concert, where we find out that at least everyone in her family thinks of her as a bit of a, loose cannon who a deadbeat, who travels around, doesn't have a proper job, and they kind of critique her for that, and not going to her own mother's funeral. Both her sister and her brother are both a bit upset by that, as
her brother's like, I sent you money so you could come home for that, and I think she used it to bail some friends out of jail or something, and and she's like, you don't understand, there was context, and he's like, yeah, whatever.
And yeah, that sounds like, it was people who were arrested for protesting. I don't know why I said that weird. Protesting something.
I assume so, yeah. I'm assuming we're naturally kind of on her side here, because she is kind of one of our lenses into this show. But it does maybe
give you a sense that she does kind of avoid some, like, the people in her life that maybe a reminder of her past, or that she's difficult in that way. Like, it does point out some kind of, like, some growth
flaws
that she can have, throughout the show.
Yeah, like when she comes back, and her sister's like, oh, so what do you need then? Because whenever you show up, it's just you need money, and that again, it's okay. So she's not a perfect character right off the bat. She obviously has some issues that she's got to work through.
Yeah. So no, I thought it did a really good job giving all three of the leads kind of enough sort of grounding and different, and they're all very different as well, which is nice. With George having the family life, and kind of not even just giving him the family life, but both his wife and daughter are developed enough that they both feel like their own characters as well, where they both have something that, like, oh, his wife actually writes a lot of his articles for him from his notes, and she's into that, and then obviously the daughter's stuff with the monsters and comics and superheroes, like, they feel very well defined immediately. So I think as far as a pilot goes, this is extremely solid.
It's up there, yeah.
Yeah, I really wouldn't fault it too much. I think someone who was watching it yesterday, who was on a stream or watching a stream I was doing, mentioned that it was maybe a little bit on the long side, a bit slow, and I kind of went into it thinking, maybe I'm going to feel that way, and I never really did. I actually felt like it was paced just fine.
Yeah, I felt like we should have kind of brushed on this in the spoiler-free stuff at the start, if anything.
Oh,
but
sure,
it's 70 minutes. I didn't feel it. Like I was.
Well, I mean HBO shows tend to be almost always 60 minutes exactly, so 10 extra minutes isn't that much of a stretch.
It's not, but
at that
I
point.
mean, even sometimes there are HBO episodes that are 60 minutes that I feel are too long, and they're just that way because HBO. But this, I mean, maybe you could have chopped 2 or 3 minutes off here or there at most, but honestly, I thought it was really well paced. The fact that the tension holds up almost the whole way through. Let's say you're kind of on edge. it has multiple sequences. With the car chase and then the Sundown chase, and it's like...
And I think, with the exception maybe the song going on a little bit too long, but maybe that's just because I get annoyed when there's people singing and dancing in movies, is that all the stuff with the montages and sort of seeing, what life is like in the time period for these characters and seeing just the examples around them. And I mentioned the ice cream place, but there was at least like 3 or 4 different moments in this just where there'd be something in the background where you'd notice there's a separate entrance or a separate place for the black people to either eat or go and do whatever it would be. And there was so many little slices of that I thought just really added to the this is a really pretentious way of putting it, but the texture of the world, where I really get a sense of the world and the atmosphere and what it feels like to be there and all that kind of thing.
I agree, because it's one of those things where, okay, from context, we can extrapolate out. We know what 1950s America at this, looks like, right? We kind of have a reasonable idea in our heads, most of us.
A broad idea, yeah.
Right. But I think every show, movie, anything that's set in any time period, even if it's one people are familiar with, should be doing these things to establish, just for anyone who doesn't know, maybe it gives the show longevity. In 50 years, if maybe people are less familiar with the 1950s as we are now for whatever reason, then this will give them all the context they need in its own, just in its own episode. And I think that's important as well, even as much as we're only really talking about it in the context of watching it now. I think it's just good for filmmaking in general to have those ideas in there.
Yeah. And I mentioned horror noir earlier, watching that documentary, which is on Shudder, by the way. It's a Shudder produced documentary. I actually would recommend people go see it. I think because the characters in this are also fans, presumably of film as well, but certainly of written fiction and horror and sci-fi, it actually feels fairly relevant overall. It's a fascinating watch, but I thought it was a nice bit of context that was added to this, or even meta context perhaps for me. So I would recommend checking it out. But no, really good first episode. I'm excited. It's a 10-episode season, so we'll be back next week, obviously. I mean, I think the positivity would make that clear, but just in case it wasn't.
I would be shocked if this show could lose us over the course of this season.
Oh yeah, I would have to completely dive.
Because there's sometimes we get a pilot and we're like, yeah, this is okay, it's pretty good, there's potential, right? That we could love this, but then, and that's what I mean. Then sometimes a handful of episodes in, we're like, I'm not really feeling this as much right now. Whereas this, we're kind of all in on from the start. This was a really positive outing.
No, this was really good. It's got an official podcast as well, I think, with one of the writers from the show. Which I know HBO have been doing here or there. A lot of
They've been doing it for
that.
a few years now, yeah.
Yeah. I know Watchmen had one, Chernobyl had one, because I listened to a few of the Chernobyl ones. So, yeah, I don't know. So, hopefully this might be their next big thing, and I'm happy to have another big show to talk about, because a lot of the ones we were talking about all kind of just wrapped up in the last week or two, so it's nice. So, yeah. So yeah, and if this is the first thing you've stumbled onto from us, it's worth mentioning, obviously we cover a lot of TV shows, we have movie podcasts, stuff like that. We are just about to have season 2 of The Boys in a few weeks' time. We'll be reviewing through that, which is going to be weekly after the first 3 episodes, which are all dumping on the same day. So, a bit different from Amazon. And then, I'm not sure what we've got scheduled after that, but there's other stuff coming, I'm sure.
I'm not sure anyone really knows what's scheduled too much after that. Everything's a bit weird.
There's definitely other stuff, but that's the sort of the one that's coming soon that I would recommend checking out. But that has been episode 1 of Lovecraft Country. Please do like if you enjoyed our discussion and you want other people to find us and want more of it coming in the future. It's a nice, easy and free way to support us. If you want to support us financially, though, you can go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and let us know what you like from us and support us and get some bonuses for your trouble. You can also, of course, get us on Twitter at mailed_fuzz for channel updates. But otherwise, that is us. So thank you once again for watching or listening. We always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. And I feel like anytime I've got a show that's like focused on black characters, I feel like my usual outro sounds oddly out of place. Not because it actually has anything to do with anything, but just because it sounds, if you don't know where it comes from, it sounds a bit weird. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I do. And usually in this scenario, you just elect to not mention it at all and just drop the catchphrase entirely.
No, I'm happy to do that, but I'm just thinking that this should probably have something else, because if we're going to do the whole season,
that's true. I'll have to think of something.
It could use something. I don't know. What's a really weird Lovecraftian kind of like? So it's like, have you got any? I don't know.
I'll get back to you on that.
I don't know. I don't have a witty outro.
We'll do some Lovecraft research.
I don't know.
You'll think about it for next week, won't you? And you definitely won't forget and get to the outro on next week's episode and then go, shit, I didn't think of anything.
I'm not making any promises.